Good morning, everyone, or good evening for those of you in the United States. Welcome to the Strat-Based ADR Institute's book launch event on the strategy of denial, American defense in an age of great power conflict. My name is Charmaine Willoughby, and I'll be your moderator for today. To formally open our program is the CEO and President of the Strat-Based ADR Institute, Professor Victor Andres Manhit. Sir Dindo, please go ahead for your opening remarks.
Good morning, Charmaine. Good morning to all our participants who are slowly coming in, and also to our invited media, both local and foreign correspondents in the Philippines. We are happy and proud to host this book launch by Elbridge Colby, or we call Bridge, and it reflects the geopolitical landscape that we try to track in the Philippines when we look at traditional, non-traditional, and evolving security threats in the Philippines, and as it relies on our external challenges. Just a week ago, the end of February, I wrote in my regular commentary in the leading newspaper, the Daily Inquirer, where I spoke of the Philippines is currently navigating a changed world order. Increased globalization and global engagement have made interdependence critical for state development, resource and means generation, and national security. And when I take note of the book of Bridge, the line, the unipolar moment is over. I've always believed that past decades, and is focused on the rise of China for Filipinos, for people in the Indo-Pacific region. It really reflects the challenge for us. But due to that growing military power, that is not, in our case, not theoretical, not conceptual, not just being read in the books, seeing it. I always tell my students before, when you speak of Baho de Masinloc, it's part of a city or a town or a municipality. It's simply 2.5 hours by car from the center of the Philippines. That the Philippines should utilize its expansive network in securing the freedom of our seas, the West Philippine Sea, to counter this aggressive behavior from Chinese maritime militia. And we are in the midst of publishing studies where we push what we call building a responsive strategic Philippine foreign and security policy, with some policy initiatives coming from our fellows, our scholars in our institute. What's unique in this book launch is it's happening, and it's good that in terms of timing, that as we face the 2022 national election, as it draws closer, less than 60 days, or a little over 61 days maybe, the electorate should keep in mind that the country's future in the next 6 years will be shaped by their vote. The people must choose a candidate that has strategic thinking to appraise the complex dynamics of regional geopolitics and earn the respect of leaders in the international arena. The next president must always be sensitive to the true will of the people. Sorry for sharing these thoughts about elections. Though we are in a book launch, we all know that the collective understanding of the challenges of our country, of the region, is very important. And with this book launch on the strategy of denial by Bridge Colby, I think we can have a better understanding of what we are confronting. Again, good morning, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, we are privileged to have with us today the author of this book. Although the book is mainly about how the United States can harness its environment to craft its own strategy, defense strategy, we in the Philippines can certainly get lessons from this book. And this is ever more important, as Sir Dindo mentioned earlier, the closer we get to the May 9 elections, as it is a timely reminder that we need to carefully choose our next set of leaders. Now, to introduce our main discussant for today, Mr. Elbridge Colby is the author of the book that we are discussing today, and is also the co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a policy initiative focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. Previously, Mr. Colby was, from 2018 to 2019, the director of the defense program at the Center for a New American Security, where he led the center's work on defense issues. Before that, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 2018. In that role, he served as the lead official in the development and rollout of the department's preeminent strategic planning guidance, the 2018 National Defense Strategy. The NDS shifted the Department of Defense focus to the challenges to US military superiority and interests posed by China, in particular, followed by Russia, prioritizing restoring the joint forces warfighting edge against these major power competitors. He also served as the primary Defense Department representative in the development of the 2017 National Security Strategy. For an overview of the book, The Strategy of Denial, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Elbridge Colby.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Charmaine, and thank you, Dindo, for the kind invitation. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak to you and the attendees and introduce the book in the Philippines, which is such an important ally of the United States, and I mean that in a very genuine sense. And actually, I've never had the privilege, unfortunately, of visiting the Philippines, but I hope to rectify that. But I hope the book will spur some interest. What I'm going to do, I'll give you a pretty brief sort of summary of the upshot of the book with relevance to the Philippines. And I think the book, in a lot of ways, in ways that are not always probably pleasant, is very relevant to the Philippines, because I think American defense planning and what I would think of as coalition defense planning is going to be increasingly relevant to the Philippines, and not just in the gray zone area, but in the potential for a significant contingency involving the People's Republic of China. So my book is, as Dindo pointed out, my book is motivated by the need for the United States to grapple better with the reality of what I think of as power scarcity in the way that economists use it, which is to say, we no longer have the sort of preponderance of power that we had in the international environment, say in the 1990s or 2000s. And now, you know, we're still very strong. This is not a critique of the United States' fiber or something, but we're 20% of global GDP. Of course, China above all is rising, but a range of other countries, India, many of the ASEAN countries are occupying a greater and greater share of global GDP. So as a practical reality, we can no longer kind of smother all the potential threats we might face with an overabundance of resources. And in that context, we need to have a strategy. And in this sense, a strategy is not a clever plan. Rather, it's more of like a logical framework for making decisions and figuring out what you need to do. And unfortunately, despite the National Defense Strategy of 2018, we continue to struggle in our ability to do this. But so the purpose of the book for the United States is to say, this is, I think, what we fundamentally need to do, and we should act accordingly. But of course, and I don't say this in a chest beating way, our decisions have immense implications for many countries around the world, including those who are allied with us, like Manila, and I'll get into that in a sec. So if we don't have enough power to do everything, we need to prioritize, like anything, like a company or anything else. And what does that mean? Well, basically by deduction, I think the most important interest the United States has in the international environment is preventing China from dominating Asia. And that's because Asia is the most important region of the world. Despite the transatlantic bent of the American establishment, Asia is going to be upwards of 50% of global GDP. So it's just the most important region. And the most important other state in the international system is China. It's 10 times the size of Russia's GDP. So, I mean, I don't think I need to be convinced that to a Philippine audience, but it is still something akin to heresy, unfortunately, in the in Washington, especially at this juncture. But if that's the case, how do we go about doing that? How do we achieve the goal of denying China regional hegemony? Because our interest in it is very, very great. We don't want to live under China's thumb, but we also are very distant, and China is very powerful and can do a lot of harm to us as well as others. The answer is what I think of as an anti-hegemonic coalition. And this is basically a balancing coalition, familiar from history, certainly in European history, motivated by a negative goal. Now, negative goals have a sort of bad odor, but actually they're, in a lot of ways, they're better because they're more ecumenical. So the goal is not to impose our will or our way of life on everybody in Asia or establish an American empire. The goal is rather to deny China hegemony. And this is a very important point that, frankly, the political culture in the United States has difficulty accepting because the liberal internationalism is so deeply rooted. And as you could probably tell, I approach this from more of what you might think of as a conservative realist approach. But if this anti-hegemonic coalition is what we want to check China's aspirations for regional dominance, that's well and good. And in fact, I think we see that. And I stress that this coalition is more of an idea than a formal body. So, we see outlines of it with things like AUKUS and the Quad and Japan relationship with Australia. But I don't think we need an Asian NATO. We just need something that works together well enough to check China's domineering aspirations, which we can talk about, but I think are pretty manifest at this point. So this is actually happening. So this is good news. The bad news is that China has a way to respond effectively. And I think we need to be thinking anticipatorily about what China's best strategy is. And my deductive conclusion is that China's best strategy is what I think of as a focused and sequential strategy, which is not the domino theory, but is basically to try to defeat this coalition without paying the cost of a major war or a total war. If Beijing wants to be regionally dominant, yes, but it doesn't want to start World War III and do what Hitler did and start the war with everybody and probably lose. Instead, what it can do is try to achieve what you might think of as a systemic effect in Asia with a more limited application of coercion. And my favorite example of this, of where you can have systemic effects geopolitically without a massive war, is the wars of German unification, which upended the European balance of power in fundamental ways without a total system-wide war. So this is essentially Beijing's goal, in my view. Best strategy is to find vulnerable members of this coalition, put a sort of laser on them, sort of impose this coercion on them, and then force their disaffiliation from this coalition, and then demonstrate to others that they will be subject to the same treatment, and in a sense cause a run on the bank of this coalition's credibility, right? So that basically it collapse or short circuit the coalition without having to have a total war. Now, China might be able to do this with non-military means, but frankly, I don't think it will. I think our experience of economic sanctions suggests they're limited in their efficacy in getting countries to do what they really don't want to do. And in fact, I think China's experience with Australia and others right now is showing a similar conclusion, or pointing to a similar conclusion. So that's good news. It means I'm not as hard line on some of the decoupling things as other people are, because I actually think we can trade with China without exposing ourselves to being completely subordinated. But the bad news is that China will then look to other instruments, and the other instrument is military force. And China has an incredibly formidable military. And it's not a military that is focused on territorial defense or even just subordinating Taiwan. It is increasingly what we call a power projection military, a military designed essentially like our own to send military forces far and impose their will. And of course, this immediately will have ramifications for the Philippines. So this is what we have to worry about. And particularly what we have to worry about is China's application in a military fashion of this focused and sequential strategy through a localized or limited war to, if you will, zap a country within this anti-hegemonic coalition, and then sort of subordinate it, and then demonstrate to everyone else effectively that the coalition is hollow, and particularly the United States is hollow. China has the military increasingly to be able to do this. So who has to worry in this context? Well, paradoxically, it's actually the countries that are connected to the United States that are Beijing's best target. And I consider Taiwan to effectively, from a defense planning point of view, to be within the perimeter, within our defense perimeter. And I can go into that if you want. So Beijing's best first target is Taiwan. It's obviously optimized to deal with Taiwan. Its political claims are strongest against Taiwan. And its best theory of victory is actually a direct invasion. It's not gray zone. I'm happy to get into that. I think gray zone is generally a distraction, certainly for the United States. As Napoleon said, if you want to take Vienna, take Vienna. If you want to subordinate Taiwan, you're not going to do it by gray zone. They've actually strengthened the hand of the DPP over the last 10 or 12 years, and they've completely discredited one country, two systems with what's happened in Hong Kong and elsewhere. So Taiwan is not going to fall into their hands. It's actually more inclined to balance. So if China really wants to resolve the problem, it's going to be inclined to use force. The problem is for the Philippines, and this is the point I would stress that's most relevant to Manila, is I think the Philippines is the second natural target for China. And this probably seems kind of strange or what have you. But I think if you follow my logic geopolitically, China, its first target is Taiwan for the reasons I mentioned, and China's goals politically with its actual war aims, if it used force against Taiwan, would be annexation effectively because it has irredentist claims on Taiwan. But after Taiwan, its goals would be more geopolitical. It would be to collapse this coalition, right? And if you're going to do that, if you're going to force a country to disaffiliate, in a sense, compromise its fundamental independence, autonomy in a way it doesn't want to, direct force is going to be the most effective way to do so. The example I use, well, I mean, we're seeing it right now in Ukraine, is that the Russians eventually determined that the only way they could try to impose their will was through the use of direct military force. But 2003, the Iraq example is another illuminating example, which is, I think mistakenly, but the Bush administration's view was we needed to get Saddam Hussein to give up his putative WMD. He refused to do so under sanctions, under bombardment, et cetera. And so the United States invaded, not to annex Iraq, obviously, but to force it to do something it really didn't want to do. I mean, Japan or Germany are similar examples in 1945. So this is the problem that we would face, certainly if Taiwan were to fall to China, but even potentially if Taiwan doesn't and China's military capability continues to expand, is that I think its natural next best target, and I go into this in the book, is the Philippines. And this is because the Philippines is connected to the United States. It's the geography of the Philippines is extremely important, especially for Southeast Asia, which is going to be a critical arena of competition and where there are a lot of states that are hedging. So the Philippines is very valuable, particularly to deny the Philippines alliance with the United States. But of course, that would China would demand that. And I assume Manila would not just go along with it unless under coercion. And if China were really wanting to reliably be able to coerce Manila, it would want the ability to use direct military force. And the reality is that China is going to have that ability, because China is not, people talk about anti-access area denial or the maritime militia, but China is going to have a space architecture to target. It's going to have long-range aviation and missiles to hit facilities in the Philippines and defending the Philippines. It's going to have air assault and amphibious forces to land on the Philippines and essentially impose its will. And this is the threat that we face over time. I know this may sound kind of extreme, but we are within the planning horizon from a defense point of view of when that reality will come to be. It will probably be later in this decade that the PLA is able to do something like that, at the latest early the next decade. And in fact, we can already see the PLA is building, obviously in the South China Sea, very, very formidable military bases to help project power, not only against the Philippines, but beyond, and is exploring military bases even well beyond Southeast Asia and the South China Sea. So this is the thing, and I think this is the logic of what, in terms of what this matters for the Philippines, is I think it really is an added urgency to working together, and not in a kind of, symbolic way. But the situation, I think, is quite dire. My own view is that we are now within the window where the Chinese may take action, direct action against Taiwan. This is the view of Admiral Davidson, Admiral Aquilino, and others. It may not happen tomorrow. It's not impossible. I wouldn't bet on it. But we are already within the sort of 2027 is the latest, essentially, that the PRC has purportedly assessed that it wants to have the confident ability. And in fact, the Taiwan defense minister said a couple months ago, they may already have the ability. And the United States is insufficiently focused. And of course, what I'm trying to do in the United States is get the focus on Asia as the priority theater and a strategy of denial. So what we need to do together in response is the United States, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, in various permutations, need to have a strategy of denial, which is basically the ability to deny China its own ability to impose direct force on one of those states within the US defense perimeter, which is to say, consummate an invasion. So in the pacing scenario, which is actually the line, well, I was very pleased, Assistant Secretary of Defense Eli Ratner, today in testimony in the House of Armed Services, he said that Taiwan is the pacing scenario, China is the primary challenge, and we are pursuing a strategy of denial. Minister of Defense Dutton in Australia has talked about a strategy of denial. So we're getting there. The problem is resource and prioritization, because it's very, even though the strategy of denial is a relatively low standard, it's basically saying I'm going to block your invasion and then I'll be able to survive and keep going. Because of China's size and sophistication and resources, it's very difficult militarily, especially given the proximity problem. The point obviously Taiwan is about 100 miles from the Chinese coast. The point I often make to American audiences is, well, the island of Luzon is 100 miles, as I understand it, from Taiwan. Ambassador John Negroponte is a friend and mentor, and who introduced me to Hank. He pointed out that I think you can see Taiwan on a clear day from parts of Luzon. Maybe he's wrong, in which case it's my fault. I misunderstood him. But South Korea is 100 miles from the Chinese coast also. So proximity is a problem we need to face, because most of the important Asian countries are clustered along the Western Pacific. So I think this is the urgency. This is the debate I'm having in the United States, is that we cannot get distracted in Europe. There are things we need to do, but we need to ensure prioritization of our military to the critical theater and against the most potent potential foe, which is China, not Russia. And we need our allies to do everything they can within their power more to make a more robust deterrent. And the critical actor here is Japan, given its scale. They need to increase defense spending and integrate their military efforts more with the United States. Taiwan absolutely needs to do more and make itself more of a porcupine. Australia is kind of leading the way. South Korea spends a lot on defense. Hopefully with the new government, it will become a bit more aligned. But I think in the case of the Philippines, what I would say is doing as much as we can together to make the alliance able to deny China's ability to project decisive military power against the Philippines, because that is going to be within its potential capability within the coming years. And we may say that's impossible. We may say that can't happen, but I think it can. And I think Xi Jinping and the way the Chinese military are behaving, and certainly their power, would suggest prudence. So and prudent preparation in order to deter war. So maybe with that, I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Elbridge. That is certainly a comprehensive overview of the book. There are so many more. There are so many more insights. If everybody here in the webinar can get a chance to get their hands in the book and read it very carefully, because for Filipinos, there's really a lot that we can pick up from it. Now we turn to a discussion by Professor Renato De Castro. He's a trustee and program convener at Stratbase ADRI, and he is likewise a professor of international studies at De La Salle University. For a framing of the book in the Philippine context, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor De Castro.
Good morning for those who are here in Asia, and good evening for our American friends and allies who are, of course, in the East Coast. Well, my basic reaction, of course, my discussion would be limited by two. I haven't read the book, and while Bridge was discussing the meat of his topic, which I really find very interesting, I basically share your sentiment. I've been raising this point to American friends and the Filipino defense establishment here about the fact that we are basically in the center of what I will call this geostrategic storm in the region, primarily because we are a prisoner of geography. We're so close to Taiwan. People here had forgotten that on the first day after Pearl Harbor, the American, the bombers, the B-17 bombers and the pursuit planes in Clark were destroyed by bombers coming from Taiwan, Japanese bombers coming from Taiwan. This has been basically forgotten. It surprised General MacArthur. It surprised General Brereton. How come they were here? Carriers were still in Hawaii. No, they came from Taiwan. So he basically raised a very important point and something that both allies would have to discuss. Now, my reaction first of all is what you have basically said is not entirely new. It reflects basically the thought of American geostrategic thinkers since the 1920s, since the 20th century. What is new, of course, the fact that you presented it in the 21st century. Of course, this reminds me of I teach a course on geopolitics. I'm teaching right now in the National Defense College of the Philippines, and I'll be teaching a course of geopolitics. And I usually focus on American geostrategic thinkers, primarily because of, we're an ally of the United States. And this is basically my dissertation in South Carolina, studying the alliance relationship. So I'm basically looking back just a week after Pearl Harbor, when supposed to be the father of American, the notion of grand strategy emerged, Carl Mead Earl, who convened a conference in Yale University just a week after Pearl Harbor. And when, of course, he convened a number of American academics and asked them, what is basically our contribution, could be our contribution to this war that happened, of course, in Europe in 1939. And he basically raised a point you mentioned. The United States simply doesn't have this tradition of warfare and statecraft, in contrast to the Europeans. What the United States could basically provide would be, of course, its economic wealth and, of course, its technology. But of course, in the 20th century, as you mentioned, it's basically been equalized by China's emergence as an economic power. It's not anymore the Cold War, when the United States had to engage two Eurasians that simply did not have the material, superiority that the United States enjoyed in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So this is a totally different ball game. I just, been presenting this just, a few days after the war happened. We are now engaged in a new Cold War. But as Marx said, history doesn't repeat itself. One could be a tragedy, the other one is a farce. Now, this is a totally different Cold War because the United States, China, and the Eurasian alignment have almost the same material resources as the United States. So this complicates the picture. So again, this is where, of course, going back to Carl Mead Earl, this is where the United States would have to look at the importance of statecraft. Because, in terms of material superiority, it's almost on par. So this is where, of course, the United States would have to look at its tradition of statecraft that, of course, emerged during the Cold War. So it's a matter of opening up again the playbook during the Cold War, but taking into account it's a totally different situation in the 21st century. Then you raise a second point, which is, of course, a matter of debate in the United States ever since, of course, 1941, which is a more important region, Asia or Europe. Of course, just a week before Pearl Harbor, upon the advice of the British General Staff to the new American General Staff led by General George Marshall, it would be Europe first. And again, the same policy continued after Pearl Harbor. So you have to take into account the unholy alliance between Admiral Ernest King and, of course, General Douglas MacArthur. You see to it that despite the official policy, it's still Europe first. The first American offensive during the Second World War happened in the Pacific in Guadalcanal, not in North Africa during Operation Storch. And of course, this has something to do with the dynamics. That was the case, of course, during the Second World War. I don't know what will be the situation right now. Despite President Barack Obama's announcement of the strategic rebalancing to Asia, every now and then something would happen in Europe that will, of course, attract the attention of people, the political and military elite in Washington, D.C., to realize that you have about 2 continents away from the Pacific. You have to cross the the continental USA, then again the Pacific, before you could reach to East Asia, whereas Europe is just across the Atlantic. So you always have to take into account the tyranny of geography. Washington is in the East Coast. American cultural and, of course, in a way, political orientation is still directed towards Europe. And it's happening again in the light of what's happened in Ukraine. And we just listened to the State of the Nation address of President Joe Biden. He mentioned, of course, Ukraine, NATO, Europe, not a single mention about the Indo-Pacific region. So what might happen here, Bridge, is again, you might be a voice in the wilderness, just like Douglas MacArthur during the stalemate in the Korean War. I won't talk about the nuclear, but the fact that at that time he was telling President Truman the threat will be here in Asia, whereas of course President Truman just had entertained a visit by, was it Prime Minister Attlee, who convinced him, Europe is still more important than Asia. Asia should be always seen as a sideshow. Thank God you raised the fact that it's not anymore a sideshow in the 21st century. And this is something I really also find it interesting, and which I discussed to my class. And again, just a point I raised, what you raise is not actually new. It's just a refreshing view in the 21st century. The starting point, of course, is we go back to the height of the Second World War, 1942, and I teach this in my class. Nicholas Spigman, when he talked about the importance, U.S. strategy in this war, it's an it's a balancing strategy, both in Asia and in Europe. Because if you have a dominant European power in Europe and a dominant power in Asia, they will have the capabilities to basically, of course, threaten the Western Hemisphere. This was, of course, raised again. It still reminds me of when I was working on my dissertation in South Carolina, when I look at the 1990 base strategy of the Pentagon. Again, the notion is, we have to look at Asia again. At that time, of course, the threat was in terms of just North Korea. China was totally out of the picture. In fact, I'll just share this. In 2001, when I presented my dissertation on the alliances, my argument is the United States would have to strengthen its alliances again in Asia. My dissertation panel laughed at me. What will threaten us in Asia? China is only good in producing products for Walmart. China will not have the capability to threaten the region or the United States. This was on 2001. Then a day after that, you have the Hainan Island incident. Then I told my panel again, you think you have to think again whether China is only good at producing goods for Walmart? Of course, you basically said, it's it. The real threat again is here. The purpose is to balance an emerging power that is, of course, China. But again, you're confronted with the second problem, the second dilemma of American, U.S. and foreign defense, U.S. foreign and defense policies. Which is more important, Asia and of course Europe? Unfortunately, I did not have the chance to listen to your talk about China, the best strategy. Although I have basically the same agreement, I still remember this in 2005. This American think tank. I forgot the name. The one is based in Seattle in Washington, D.C. National Bureau of Asian Research held a conference. This was in 2005. A Southeast Asian and American view on China. The American perspective then was still focused, of course, on terrorism and, of course, counterterrorism in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Then I raised this point. Terrorists could not field a conventional army. They could not occupy a country. They could not create a sphere of influence. Only a major power could do such a thing. So the long-term threat will, of course, be China. And they just look at me with intense interest. At the time, American strategic thinkers were still focused on the war on terror. And you basically raise a point. It will be China. And of course, you also raise an inconvenient truth that, of course, had been ignored by key American analysts, and of course, even here in the Philippines, especially here in the Philippines. Just a few weeks ago, we have a webinar here, and she's a very good friend of mine from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Bonnie Glaser, who was talking about Taiwan. And an Australian guy asked a question. It's very difficult to assess Taiwan because there is no American ally near Taiwan, which I cannot help but react. You have an American ally just across the Bashi Channel, and that's no less than the Philippines. Bonnie Glacier said, You have never figured this out and never thought of it. When we talk about the Philippines, we talk of the South China Sea. When we talk of Taiwan, we talk of Northeast Asia. But the reality is there. And of course, this became apparent in March 1996. When just before the Kitty Hawk went to the Taiwan Strait, it went to Manila Bay. So there's a connection there. You raised a very important point. For American decision planners to think about, the best area where, of course, American forces operate would not be from Okinawa, could not be in Taiwan. It will be in Northern Luzon. The same way, of course, the Japanese used Taiwan to impose air superiority on Luzon in 1941, and that will be the case again in the 21st century. But the greatest challenge is for Filipino defense policymakers. Especially now we have an election. You have a candidate who said that's none of our business. But I believe the military, armed forces of the Philippines, the Department of National Defense, are very much aware of the fact that, one way or the other will be dragged into this conflict, whether we like it or not. And this is something that both sides will have to discuss. Any Chinese, Chinese calculation from Beijing is always linked the Philippines, Taiwan, and Japan in what they call the first island chain. Whenever China would breach to the first island chain, all countries in the first island chain would be affected. And this is something we have to discuss. I will have to end here. I look forward to a lively discussion. Thank you very much again for giving me the honor. ADRI and the Philippine-US Society, and of course, Bridge, for giving me the opportunity to be a discussant in your fantastic book. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Professor De Castro. Now I'm going to ask Bridge to respond to your comments. But before that, I'd like to invite our audience, if you have any questions or points to raise, to please write them in our Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time for a couple of questions in a bit. But for now, I'd like to ask Bridge if you have any counter responses to the points that Sir Rene raised.
Well, no counters, just a loud agreement. I mean, Renato and I are very much on the same page, and I avowedly concur with your point about my book being rooted in actually an American strategic thinking. The problem is that we became, frankly, drunk on hubris after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now we've pursued an unnecessarily expansionist and wasteful strategy of sort of, I would say, something more akin to like global liberal empire that is no longer tenable if it ever was, and has not succeeded. So now we need to go back to the basics, and you will see a number of references to Spikeman in the book. Spikeman is kind of Spikeman and Clausewitz and a few others are really the keys. But I love some of you're really great. I mean, the point about Japanese aircraft operating from Formosa on December 8th. I didn't know that, but that makes total sense. And range is so important. Just a couple of thoughts. Even though I grew up in Asia, actually, and I'm a fourth generation to live in Asia, and I have a strong affinity for Asia, I wouldn't say I'm an Asia firster. I am a decisive theater firster. In 1914 and 1941, Europe was the decisive theater. It was the center of the global economy. It controlled the colonial empires, rightly or wrongly, well, wrongly, but that was the reality. So if we won in Europe, we would eventually be able to take care of Japan. And of course, you're right that we only imperfectly implemented the Europe First strategy. But the thing was, we alone were bigger than the three Axis powers as an economy, let alone with the British Empire and the Soviet Union. We dwarfed them in power and GDP. So we could afford to be sort of profligate, but exactly as you say, Renato, we can no longer afford to do that because China is of equivalent size. And hopefully we can offset that with the coalition, but this is the difficulty: is the coalition is difficult to sustain because it has many vulnerable points. So the point I use is, apparently Winston Churchill said in 1913 or 1914, if you get things right in the decisive theater, then you can put everything else right afterwards, but not the reverse, right? So if we get things right in Asia, we can mitigate in other theaters, and we can mitigate China's influence. But if we don't get things right along the first island chain, and I'm not even talking about the Indo-Pacific, militarily, it's the first island chain, because that's where the center of gravity of East Asian economic weight is. And given the flaccid nature of the strategic orientation in the ASEAN countries other than the Philippines, they are likely to be movable by China. They will be intimidatable, frankly. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew's cutting comment about Thailand, that they bend before the wind blows. If China shows that they are the winning power, I think we will likely get a lot of bandwagoning behavior from other ASEAN countries. So this is a problem. The other thing is, I really agree with you, Renato, about a really important point for a country like the Philippines. And it's not for me as an American to say what you should do, but what I will say, one of the things I've enjoyed about, really appreciated very deeply about the reception of my book in partner and ally countries. For instance, there was a review in Finland, somebody just reviewed it in Turkey, is the ability to take the logic, as you are, Renato, and apply it to the particular situation of your country. And obviously we're long, close allies, but somebody saying in Finland, okay, I can see how, or here's the logic, here's what it means for America, and here's what this means for us. And I think if you follow the logic, you're exactly right, Renato, because neutrality is a luxury of the peripheral in a way, right? If you're New Zealand, you can be neutral, and Indonesia even can be neutral now if Taiwan doesn't fall, and if the Philippines is not subordinated, then it can. But that's easy because they're behind the front line. They're way behind the front line. If you're Peru or Chile, you can be neutral, right? But if you're the Philippines, whether you like it or not, you're exactly right. You're critical strategic geography, A, and B, like Taiwan, the same as Taiwan, your critical strategic geography, whether you like it or not, and you have this tight link historically with the United States. So that means that for China and for the United States, you're both very important. And not just for the United States, for Japan, for Australia, for Taiwan, for South Korea, even for Vietnam. So you are important, and that makes you, and if you're, and I say this a similar message in South Korea, if you try to neutralize and hedge, you risk becoming a battlefield. Whereas if you're closely aligned, then you'll be protected, because then you'll have an effective forward denial strategy. China will see that you can't be taken advantage of. And if you look at the Cold War, for instance, in Europe, I think this was the model that West Germany pursued. It said, we're going to hew closely to the Americans and militarize the border. Then the Soviets will see that they cannot pick us off. They cannot turn us into a battlefield. And I think if I were in the Philippines, that's what I would want. Because the problem is, if there's foot dragging, China can take advantage of it. The problem that we face in the Philippines is that we need to reestablish a strong American or allied military presence. So we need to improve things, whereas China would benefit from inaction. And that's the problem in the Philippines, and what I'm hoping things like my book can contribute to is to say, this is not about Americans coming in and bossing people around. I don't like that kind of thing anyway, but rather this is the only way it's going to work, because we have to defend it the first island chain. So anyway, I think we have a similar approach, and I hope that one is. I'm glad to hear it's ascendant within the Philippine defense establishment for sure.
Thanks so much to both Elbridge and Sir Rene. These are really very important points. And as we, Sir Rene, you want to
Just
respond?
a very short comment. Rich, you mentioned you've been here in Asia, but you haven't been to the Philippines. You should come here and see the largest American war cemetery outside.
I would love it. I
It's
would
here.
really welcome that. I've never, I grew up in Japan and Singapore, Hong Kong. I've never made it to the Philippines, unfortunately. So it is a huge gap in my personal, obviously such an important relationship too. So.
Right. And as the COVID restrictions are slowly being lifted, we will certainly welcome you when you finally decide to come over. Now, for some of our questions, Professor De Castro mentioned something about statecraft and the important role, the critical role that statecraft will really play in these geopolitical dynamics. Now, how can we apply the strategy of denial that Rich was talking about in his book in regard to the context of the South China Sea? And within that context, how can the Philippines then what are some of the things that a small state like the Philippines can do in order to resist Chinese influence and eventually to avoid the worst case scenario that you have described in your book, Bridge? So either Bridge or Professor Renato, of course, can chime in and weigh in on this. Thanks.
Well, I guess I would say my main message is I think the Philippines should concentrate much more on this high-end military scenario rather than the South China Sea gray zone kind of thing. I understand that's an important issue and politically very salient, but again, if we look at China's military development, obviously the maritime militia are very formidable relative to Philippine capacity, but they already have the largest navy in the world according to ship count, and certainly larger than the U.S. Pacific Fleet or the combined U.S.-Japanese Pacific fleets. And they have the advantage of proximity. So China, the risk is that China will increasingly be able to have military escalation dominance, so that if there is a conflict arising over, say, Scarborough Shoal or something, the Chinese will be able to impose their will, and they will essentially resolve the issue in their favor. And even more, that they would not need to stop there, that they would be able to defeat if they wanted to. The risk, if we don't focus enough, and if we're not properly postured in places like the Philippines and Japan, is they will be able to invade the Philippines and impose their will, right? Like, say, the United States has done. I mean, not our best moment, but the United States has been able to go around the Caribbean over the last couple hundred or two, century and a half, and basically go in and just impose our will. I mean, we don't do that as much anymore, unfortunately, but I mean, that's the sort of the future if China has that military dominance. So it's going to be whatever political issue is the precipitating factor. It will be China's ability to just impose its will and say, essentially do effectively what Putin was probably trying to do, which is to say, I don't need to get into huge war. I don't need to do what the Japanese did in the Philippines. I don't want to annex the Philippines, but I'm going to go in there in Manila and I'm going to tell them, kick out that government and you put in a more pliable government, or you give me what I want. And that's what we need to guard against. That's what we need to be able to deny.
Right. Thanks for that. Professor De Castro?
Just 2 points regarding, statecraft in the context of the United States when I mentioned it. Again, going back to Carl Mead Earl, when he was saying, and this, of course, is also the view of the Brits, especially by Winston Churchill. Americans have all this material superiority, especially after they entered the Second World War, but they simply have the degree of slyness that the British have shown in the world because of their colonial empire. That Britain was able to build a colonial empire because it was absent-minded. No, it was also because of British slyness or statecraft. And this is something that, of course, I mentioned. This is something that I think, with the experience of the Cold War and in the 21st century, that sooner or later we'll see being practiced, coming out in the United States. Now, in the context of China here in the Philippines, the Chinese statecraft directed against the Philippines is a classic case of Sun Tzu art of war, to win without actually fighting. This intimidating us with its maritime militia, of course, also buying some of our politicians, if not a lot of our politicians, choosing a Chinese candidate among the presidential balls. Now, the key challenge for us is simply to prevent China to win without actually fighting. So this is, even in the South China Sea, just to show China that no, we won't allow you to win by default. We would challenge you one way or the other, not at the same level as any great Japan or Taiwan could challenge you, but we would simply refuse to allow you to win by default, to win without actually fighting. I think that's the bottom line when we talk about how do we have to deal with Chinese statecraft. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It seems like both Bridge and Sir Rene are in agreement as to the dangers of hedging or being neutral. It's more important to actually take a side, to be aligned, so that the Philippines does not become a battlefield, as you mentioned. Now, in the interest of time, I will only raise one more question, and that has to do with a hypothetical situation, something that might happen in 2024 in the US elections. What will then become of the geopolitical environment if in case Trump wins again in 2024? What are some of your forward-looking thoughts on this? Maybe I'll start with Elbridge and then Sir Rene.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the Trump administration was the one that really broke the mold on confronting China and was, I would say, more of an Asia first orientation, at least like every administration. There are different views and polling, but I'd say that the senior level officials, I mean, the president, but Vice President Pence was talking about China, Secretary Pompeo, certainly Secretary Esper, Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor. So there were holdout elements because it reflects a very difficult choice. But I mean, I'm biased because I'm a Republican and I'm fighting this battle internally. But I generally think whatever one thinks about the personalities and the politics, and I should stress that there are many Democrats who are friends of mine and so forth who are trying to do something similar. But I would say that actually a Republican administration should probably be better for our Asia strategy because it's going to be more focused on Asia. It's going to be less what Renato was saying, that romantic sort of transatlantic. I referred to it actually in a piece in the German press, the sort of romanticism that President Biden has about the transatlantic relationship. It's not really there on the Republican side. There's also more comfort about using hard power and being in a confrontational mode if necessary, which is, I think, kind of what we need with China right now. And also the Republican voters are much more negative on China than they were in the past, and more negative on China than Democratic voters tend to be. So I'm not saying that's inherent. I mean, there are plenty of Democrats who are great on this, but I don't think there's too big of a concern of like a pullback or something. I mean, that there is that constituency, and it's growing in across the country, but I think it's still a distinct minority.
Thank you. Sir Rene, some thoughts on a
Well,
potential
yes.
Trump presidency?
This is sort of the popular notion, and of course magnified here in the Philippines. Because here in the Philippines, every time we have a president, suddenly you have a new policy, like what happened in the last 12 years. We tend to forget the practice in the United States of what you call, especially when it comes to foreign policy, very important key foreign policy issues, the notion of bipartisanship, that there should be a degree of continuity. So I still remember this upon his confirmation and the commission on appointment in the United States Congress. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was asked, what's the best thing that the Trump administration has done? And he said this: starting the competition with China, and basically sending the signal to the American public, to the American bureaucracy, to the world, that it could continue that policy, of course, with a different take. The key element of that policy, that China, moving away from what I would call the Kissingerian
I think Professor De Castro is having some connectivity issues. But before I move, there are a couple more questions in our Q&A box, and I think that has to do with those two questions have to do with the importance of maintaining the alliances. Certainly, there are a lot of things that we need to do to sustain the alliance. Any thoughts on that, Bridge?
Charmaine, are they talking about the U.S.-Philippine alliance in particular, or more broadly?
Yes, the U.S.-Philippine alliance.
Well, I mean, I would say I think there was a big step forward a couple of months ago when President Duterte agreed kind of the next steps on, as I understand it, on defense cooperation. So that's a big thing. But I think we need to move as quickly and sort of effectively as possible towards a more fuller scale level of cooperation that's kind of that's consistent with this sort of level of urgency that I'm talking about. But yeah, I mean, I think that's what we gotta. that's the kind. I mean, I think our alliance relationship should take place in this sort of the context of what I'm talking about, which would give it, I think, quite a bit more urgency.
Right. Thank you so much. Sir Rene, do you want to, you got cut off earlier. Anything else you'd like to add?
Just to mention about, what the NATO allies are doing. Those were things that the Trump administration had been telling them. Increase your defense budget, and it's happening right now. You have to take about the Russian invasion for them to see the wisdom of the Accordo, and they view it as an impolite advice from the Trump administration. It's something they're doing right now. Like, for example, look at what Germany's doing, right? So, in a way, if you look at it from the proper perspective, the Trump administration was really not that bad in terms of disruption. It's the messaging that was a problem. But in terms of key direction of U.S. defense policy, it's basically continuation even of the Obama administration pivot to Asia. Okay, I am there.
The only thing I would say is I would actually say it was better because the Obama, they talked about it, but other than Bob Work, they didn't actually do anything. And you needed a confrontational approach to China to be credible and realistic. So that in 100 years, I think that's the most important thing that people will look back at the Trump administration on. And I think that's, to your point about what Blinken said, is right. The only thing I would say is, you said something that it slipped my mind. Oh, yes, you're exactly right about the Europeans. The thing is that sadly for the Ukrainians, the NATO Europeans have the luxury of waiting until Russia invaded a neighboring country, and they have plenty of buffer. So the Germans have one large country in between them and Ukraine, Poland, with the quite robust military. You don't have that luxury. If Taiwan falls, the threat to you will be acute and direct. So, and similarly with Japan, this is the problem, is that we need to get to the left of that event, not only for the sake of the people on Taiwan, but more for our own collective benefit.
All right. So thanks so much to Bridge and Serene for sharing their insights. Now, before I turn the virtual floor over to Hank, perhaps Bridge, you'd like to invite our audience regarding where they can access the book.
Sure, great. No, thank you very much. And I really welcome people's engagement with the book on Twitter. I'm on Twitter, or you can find me on our website, www.themarathoninitiative.org. But you can find the book. I'm not sure what the best way to buy it. I hope it's available in bookstores in physical copy in Manila and maybe elsewhere in the Philippines, but it's available worldwide on audio, and it should be also on Kindle or electronic format. And if you can't find a copy, I've put sort of abbreviated versions in one capacity or other on that website, themarathoninitiative.org, a lot of my media engagement. So if you're interested in kind of getting a shorter, maybe punchier version, I hope you'll take the time to look at the book, but would really welcome continuing the conversation with friends in the Philippines. And it's been a real pleasure and an honor to be able to introduce it with you all at Strat-Base ADR. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Now, to officially close our program for this morning or this evening, may I invite Hank Hendrickson, the Executive Director of the U.S.-Philippine Society. Hank?
Thank you, Charmaine. Since it's since the book's been published, we've followed the discussions on strategy of denial in the U.S. and elsewhere, frankly, around the world among foreign policy thinkers. And now credit Bridge for bringing the book and the discussion to the main arena, which is Asia, of course. The U.S.-Philippine Society is pleased to support this program, and along with our partners in Manila. We thank friends at Strat-Base, including Dindo, Paco. Our special thanks also to Renato for contributing so substantially to the program, and to Charmaine for doing such an excellent job in moderating this important discussion. Their perspectives were especially important in helping our American audience to understand more fully Filipino attitudes on these central foreign policy questions. In return, we hope that our Filipino audience today may have gained insights into options Washington faces in securing peace, freedom and prosperity for Americans, and building partnerships abroad. Let me cite just two factors that came up tonight that make the book and the timing of this discussion important today. First, the reaction by Europeans and NATO to the Russian invasion of Ukraine underscores the essential value of alliances and partnerships acting collectively in response to the use of force against a neighbor. What Bridge describes as the importance of anti-hegemonic coalitions eyeing the rise of China in Asia inevitably invite comparison. The forceful example of collective support in Europe and so evident around the world in opposition to Putin's invasion has been remarkable and probably not fully anticipated by war planners in Moscow. Those visually and materially important regional and global responses are surely being gauged carefully now in Beijing. And they would seem to argue for making coalitions and alliances in Asia even more effective as a means for enabling states like the Philippines to preserve territorial and policy independence. The other factor that makes today's event important is that it comes in the midst of the Philippines election campaign. Our stimulating discussion could help to elevate thought and debate among voters and candidates alike about foreign policy options of utmost importance. Describing strategy in the title of his book, Bridge talks about the need for US policymakers to employ a strategic framework and for approaching foreign policy and security challenges. My guess is that Bridge would welcome the same kind of strategic approach by policy leadership in the Asia region, and a presidential election campaign provides a clear, ripe opportunity for candidates to lay out their strategic vision. I'll conclude by saying thanks again to Bridge and maraming salamat to StratBase, today's participants, and those joining by Zoom. And thanks as always to members of the U.S.-Philippine Society. Your support makes programs like this possible. Thank you.
So much, Hank, and thank you, everybody. We hope to see you again in the next event. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you, Hank.
Thanks,
you, Bridge.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Renato and Charmaine. Thank you. Bye. Thanks, Renato.
Salamat,
Always.
sir.
Your beck and
Salamat.
call. Terminsky.
Bye, sir. Thank you po.
Bye.
Bye.